China has agreed to invest a whopping $400 billion into Iran over the span of 25 years.
What if I told you that the most strategically devastated country in the Iran war is not Iran itself, and it is not Israel, and it is not even the United States, but a nation that has not had a single bomb fall on its soil, has not fired a single shot, and has not lost a single soldier? Today, cameras remain locked on Tehran, on the IRGC, on the smoldering nuclear negotiations and the blockade tightening around Iranian ports. Something far larger is unfolding in silence. We have spent the last 72 hours cross-referencing intelligence assessments, military analyst reports, and geopolitical insider briefings, from the Diplomat's strategic analysis, to Bloomberg's economic reporting, to the Hudson Institute's classified adjacent assessments, to the Jerusalem Post's energy breakdowns. And what emerges is not a story about Iran at all. It is not a story about Israel. It is not a story about American carrier groups in the Gulf. It is the story of a decade-long silent empire collapsing in real time, 4,000 miles east of where everyone is looking. That empire belongs to Beijing, and the blow it is now absorbing may prove to be the most consequential strategic defeat any major power has suffered this century without a single round being fired against it. Stay with us, because what we are about to reveal changes everything you thought you knew about the Iran war and who is actually paying its highest price. You are watching Sentinel News. We are not a news channel in the traditional sense. We are an intelligence community, a place where what mainstream outlets brush past in 30-second segments gets the analytical depth it actually deserves. If you are new here, consider this your invitation to join the briefing. Tap subscribe because we cover the dimensions of global conflict that surface-level reporting simply does not go deep enough on. And to those of you returning, you already know we do not do shallow work here. You came back.
China has agreed to invest a whopping $400 billion into Iran over the span of 25 years in exchange for oil in a tight-knit agreement signed last Saturday. The deal could deepen China's already growing influence in the Middle East and hinder US efforts to keep the Islamic Republic
back because you want the layer beneath the headline. Tonight, we are going to give you exactly that. To understand why what is happening to China right now matters, you first need to understand the bigger picture. The architecture Beijing spent more than a decade quietly building across the Middle East. An architecture that until 90 days ago was considered one of the most sophisticated geoeconomic constructions of the 21st century. In March of 2021, China and Iran signed what became known as the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, a 25-year agreement valued at approximately $400 billion. To the casual observer, this looked like a routine bilateral deal. To anyone reading it carefully, it was something else entirely. It was the spine of Xi Jinping's westward expansion strategy, the indispensable land bridge for what Beijing called the China Central Asia-West Asia Economic Corridor, and the single most important node in the entire Belt and Road Initiative outside of mainland China itself. Think about what that architecture actually looked like on the ground. China National Petroleum Corporation was operating deep inside the South Pars gas field, the largest natural gas reservoir on the planet. Huawei was wiring Iran's telecommunications backbone, not just commercial networks, but the critical infrastructure that government, military, and financial systems depend on. Chinese engineering firms were developing Iran's mineral extraction base, locking in long-term access to lithium, copper, and rare earth deposits the West had been sanctioned out of. The ports of Chabahar and Jask, partially constructed with Chinese capital and Chinese labor, were designed for a single strategic purpose, to serve as exclusive oil export terminals that would route Iranian crude directly to Chinese refineries while completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. And running beneath all of it was Iran's so-called shadow fleet, a covert maritime conveyor belt of ghost tankers carrying discounted Iranian crude on a near-daily basis, feeding Chinese refineries with energy at prices no other supplier on Earth could match. By the close of 2025, China was purchasing roughly 90% of Iran's total oil exports, providing the financial lifeline that kept the heavily sanctioned Iranian regime solvent. In return, Beijing received energy security, infrastructure dominance, and a geopolitical foothold that placed Chinese strategic interests directly on the doorstep of the Persian Gulf, historically the exclusive operating theater of the United States Fifth Fleet. That was the architecture. That was the empire. And on February 28, 2026, when American and Israeli precision strikes began systematically dismantling Iranian command, control, and energy infrastructure, the entire structure began to crack along fault lines Beijing had never publicly acknowledged existed. Here is where it gets critical. When the strikes began, when Iran's leadership found itself decapitated and its energy export capacity targeted with surgical precision, Tehran turned to its most powerful partner, the nation it had bound itself to with a $400 billion contract, and asked for help. What it received from Beijing was a press statement, a diplomatic communiqué, a foreign ministry spokesman expressing concern, no naval deployment, no emergency oil credit line, no diplomatic ultimatum delivered to Washington, no emergency session at the United Nations Security Council where China holds permanent veto power. Nothing. Think about this carefully because that single detail tells us more about the actual structure of Sino-Iranian relations than 10 years of official communiques ever did. What Beijing built in Iran was not a strategic alliance. It was a resource extraction arrangement dressed in the language of friendship. And the moment the extraction chain was severed, the friendship evaporated with it. This is the doctrinal lesson every Gulf monarchy, every Belt and Road participant, every nation that ever signed a Chinese infrastructure agreement is now absorbing in real time. China's foreign ministry called the American blockade of Iranian ports a dangerous and irresponsible act. Foreign ministry spokesman Guo Jikun stated that only a full ceasefire can ease the situation and that Beijing would make efforts to help restore peace and stability. Efforts. That was the word. Not deployment, not deterrence, not leverage. Efforts. While 34 vessels were being turned back by American destroyers in the Gulf of Oman, while Chinese-bound tankers were being intercepted at sea, while the cheap Iranian energy pipeline that had fed Chinese refineries for half a decade ran completely dry, Beijing offered efforts. The chaos in Tehran has transformed what was once a strategic asset into something far more uncomfortable for Chinese state planners. It has become a massive investment black hole. Billions in committed capital, spanning everything from telecommunications, infrastructure, to transit networks, to port construction, are now at acute risk of becoming what financial analysts politely call toxic assets. In plainer language, money Beijing will never see again. The shadow fleet hunt. Now let us get into something that very few outlets have covered with the precision it deserves. The shadow fleet that moves Iranian oil to Chinese refineries was engineered specifically for the kind of pressure environment we are now witnessing. False flag registrations, spoofed transponder signals, ship-to-ship transfers conducted in international waters off the coast of Malaysia, where cargoes get reflagged, redocumented, and rebranded as Malaysian origin crude before completing the final leg of the journey to Chinese ports. The numbers tell the story. China's official customs records show zero crude oil imports from Iran since 2022. And yet, and this is the figure that should make every viewer pause, China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude oil reached 1.3 million barrels per day in 2024. That is more than double Malaysia's entire national production capacity. The mathematics simply do not work. What is being labeled as Malaysian is, by every credible intelligence assessment, Iranian. That is the scale of the covert energy bridge Beijing constructed and depended on. And right now, every vessel attempting to run that route is being hunted. On April 19, 2026, United States Naval Forces seized the sanctioned Iranian container vessel MV Tuska in the Gulf of Oman on its return voyage from China, reportedly carrying dual-use equipment with both civilian and military applications. This is the signal that should not be missed. Washington is no longer merely blockading Iran's ports. It is systematically dismantling the entire shadow architecture that kept Chinese refineries supplied with discounted crude. The bridge is gone, and what remains is a strategic petroleum reserve estimated at roughly 1 billion barrels, sufficient on paper for approximately 120 days of consumption. On the surface, that sounds like a buffer. Read it again. 120 days is not a strategy. It is a countdown. Strategic analysis. The fortress economy cracks. Now let us widen the lens to the Chinese economy itself, because this is where the story stops being about geopolitics and starts being about something far more uncomfortable for Beijing. Real factories, real workers, real supply chains breaking under real pressure. And what the data coming out of mainland China through April 2026 reveals is something Chinese state media is working remarkably hard to obscure. The fortress economy is cracking from the inside, and the cracks are widening every single week the Hormuz blockade holds. Begin with the figure that should be on the front page of every business publication on Earth. China's oil imports transiting through the Strait of Hormuz amount to at least 5.4 million barrels per day. By comparison, Russian crude flowing to China by pipeline and tanker totals roughly 2.1 million barrels per day, even after Moscow increased exports by approximately 300,000 barrels per day in early 2026. In other words, China's Gulf imports through Hormuz are more than double its total Russian intake. This is exactly why analysts who casually suggest China can simply pivot to Russian supply are mathematically incorrect. Russia does not possess the pipeline capacity, Russia does not possess the tanker fleet, and Russian seaborne crude transits maritime corridors the United States Navy could theoretically interdict with the same playbook now being executed against Iran. China stockpiled aggressively through 2025 in anticipation of exactly this scenario. But stockpiles are not a doctrine. Stockpiles are borrowed time, and borrowed time is precisely what is now running out. Consider the factory floor. Chinese automotive plants produced 27% fewer vehicles in the first 2 weeks of April 2026 compared to the same period 1 year earlier. Alicia Garcia Herrero, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, has assessed that the Chinese economy is slowing materially and that Beijing may struggle to meet its annual growth target of 4.5%. 27% fewer vehicles in 14 days, and that is the automotive sector, the strategic industry Xi Jinping has staked the entire next phase of China's economic transition upon. Electric vehicles, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing. Every one of those sectors depends on inputs that either transit Hormuz directly or are made dramatically more expensive by the energy shock radiating outward from the blockade, the ground-level tremor. Then there is the development that broke on April 28th, a development that, frankly, intelligence analysts following Chinese internal stability indicators have been quietly bracing for. In southern China, in the manufacturing province of Guangdong, thousands of factory workers staged coordinated protests after multiple plants abruptly shuttered operations on April 20th. The closures followed a sharp increase in plastic feedstock prices, driven by disruptions to petrochemical shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. Workers hung banners across factory gates bearing characters that translate to "Return my blood and sweat money." Video footage circulating briefly on Chinese social media before being scrubbed showed protesters standing in disciplined silence while uniformed police monitored the perimeter. Think about what that scene actually represents. In a political system where public protest carries genuine personal risk, where surveillance is total and consequences are immediate, workers were still standing at those factory gates with banners. That tells us, more clearly than any official economic indicator could, how severe the pressure has become at the ground level. Those plants did not close because of a distant geopolitical abstraction. They closed because petrochemical inputs surged in price the moment Hormuz transit was disrupted, and operating margins evaporated within a single billing cycle. Roughly half of the world's seaborne sulfur trade, a vital industrial input for fertilizer, batteries, and chemical processing, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Disruptions to petrochemical complexes and fertilizer supply chains have already pushed global food commodity prices upward. Damage to the major aluminum smelters at Aluminium Bahrain and Emirates. Global Aluminum has produced a shortage of automotive-grade aluminum, affecting Toyota, Nissan, BMW, and Hyundai production lines. Every single one of those disruptions strikes China harder than it strikes any other economy on Earth because China sits at the gravitational center of every one of those supply chains. Chinese manufacturers require aluminum for electric vehicles. They require sulfur for industrial chemistry. They require petrochemical feedstock for the plastics that flow into electronics, packaging, and the export goods that generate the foreign exchange the entire system depends on. This is the doctrine of supply chain degradation in its purest modern form, and historical parallel matters here. During the Second World War, the Allied submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping did not destroy the Japanese army in the field. It destroyed the industrial inputs that fed the Japanese army in the field. The targeting logic was identical. Cut the inputs, and the war machine starves itself. What we are watching across the Strait of Hormuz today is not a remake of that campaign, but the doctrinal logic underneath it is unmistakably the same. International dimension. The quiet sanction shot. Here is where it gets critical. In April 2026, the United States sanctioned one of China's largest independent refineries, the Hengrun Petrochemical Facility in Dalian, directly, by name, for processing Iranian crude oil, a so-called teapot refinery on Chinese soil sanctioned by Washington. That is not a warning shot across the bow. That is the United States telling Beijing in the clearest possible diplomatic language that it knows precisely which facilities are processing Iranian crude, knows precisely how the Shadow Fleet network operates, and is fully prepared to reach inside Chinese industrial infrastructure to apply targeted economic pressure. Beijing's response, once again, was that foreign ministry spokesman line. Efforts to help restore peace and stability, urging all parties to abide by ceasefire arrangements. That diplomatic ambiguity is itself a signal. When a great power chooses linguistic minimalism in the face of direct sanction action against its own industrial base, that minimalism is not measured strength. It is the absence of usable options. Intelligence assessments suggest that Beijing's senior leadership understood by mid-April that any forceful counter-response would invite further escalation against Chinese financial institutions and refining capacity, a price the Politburo is not currently willing to pay. If you are finding this analysis valuable, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Sharing this video takes 2 seconds, and it helps us keep bringing you this level of depth. Hit that like button. The Belt and Road credibility collapse. Now let us widen the frame further, because the Hormuz crisis is doing something to China that goes far beyond the immediate energy and economic damage. It is dismantling the credibility architecture of the entire Belt and Road initiative. China has invested more than $269 billion across Middle Eastern infrastructure since 2005. Ports, pipelines, highways, power generation, telecommunications. The implicit pitch to every signatory nation was straightforward. China is a stable, reliable, strategic partner that delivers economic development without the political conditions attached to Western capital. That was the brand. That was the promise. And then Iran, China's flagship Belt and Road partner, the anchor of the entire westward corridor, was struck, and Beijing did nothing. When the United Arab Emirates aligned with the American-led coalition calling for the strait to remain open, while Beijing remained publicly silent on the weaponization of a vital energy corridor, the structural damage deepened by an order of magnitude. Gulf monarchies are now drawing the operational conclusion. They understand precisely what Chinese security cooperation is worth when their own territory comes under pressure. The answer, demonstrably, is statements. Every Gulf state that signed Belt and Road agreements, every government from Islamabad to Jakarta to Nairobi that trusted the Chinese promise of strategic reliability is watching this moment with the closest possible attention. They are watching Beijing watch Tehran burn. And they are now asking openly and at the policy level the question Beijing has spent 2 decades engineering its diplomacy to prevent: is China a reliable strategic partner, or is China simply a buyer of resources whose loyalty extends precisely as far as the next contract? That question, once asked at the level of state policy, cannot be answered with another infrastructure announcement. It is structural damage that will outlast this war by decades. Psychological layer, the Malacca nightmare. This brings us to the dimension Beijing finds most psychologically destabilizing of all. And it is not the current pain, because pain can be managed, stockpiles can be drawn down, alternative suppliers can be cultivated at higher cost. What Beijing cannot strategically absorb is the lesson the United States has just taught the entire world by closing the Strait of Hormuz, because the lesson of Hormuz is not ultimately about Iran. The lesson of Hormuz is about China. And every strategic planner in Beijing, every admiral in the People's Liberation Army Navy, every economist in the Politburo Standing Committee has spent the last 6 weeks staring at a single word that former Chinese President Hu Jintao first introduced into Chinese strategic vocabulary in 2003, a word that has defined Beijing's deepest strategic anxiety ever since: the Malacca dilemma. The geography matters here. The Strait of Malacca, situated between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malaysian peninsula, accommodates more than 60,000 vessels annually, representing approximately 25% of global maritime trade, and critically, roughly 80% of China's imported crude oil. 80% of Chinese energy security flowing through a single waterway just 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point near Singapore. And the United States maintains military positioning at both approaches: Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Singapore, Japan, Guam. The entire architecture of American naval power across Asia has been constructed deliberately around the latent capability to pressure that strait. Here's the doctrinal point. The confrontation over Hormuz has demonstrated in real-world conditions and against a heavily militarized adversary how rapidly a choke point can be operationally closed and how quickly the economic shockwaves spread outward through the global system. The same logic is now directly transferable to Malacca, except in the Malacca scenario, the consequences cut to the heart of Asia's largest economy. Washington possesses substantially greater power projection capacity in that theater than Beijing does, supported by a network of allies and partners China has not been able to replicate. Jin Guo, a research fellow at East China University specializing in diplomacy and security, argued in the South China Morning Post that the American war with Iran reflects Washington's deepening focus on global maritime blockade strategy. He warned that the United States will likely intensify operational attention on the world's busiest shipping straits to constrain Beijing's development trajectory, calling it, and this is his phrase, an unchangeable reality. When a Chinese academic publishes that assessment in a Chinese-affiliated newspaper, that is not opposition commentary. That is internal signaling. That is Beijing's own strategic community telling the leadership what the leadership already knows. The Iran war was not just about Iran. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept, a live-fire validation of the precise mechanism that could strangle the Chinese economy if tensions over Taiwan ever transition from competition into open confrontation. Deterrence and speculation, the decision tree. The question everyone is asking is simple. What does Xi Jinping actually do next? And here's where we have to be honest about the analytical limits, because Beijing's internal deliberations are opaque, even to the best-sourced intelligence services. What we can do is map the decision tree, and every branch on that tree leads somewhere uncomfortable. Military confrontation at Malacca would mean direct hot war with the United States Navy at a moment when the Chinese economy is already absorbing the Hormuz shock, when belt and road credibility has been structurally damaged, and when Beijing is watching its most important strategic partner implode from within. That option is not on the table in any serious form. Beijing is too disciplined for it. The long-term mitigation strategy is electrification. Every electric vehicle that comes off a Chinese assembly line marginally reduces Chinese transportation fuel demand. Chinese gasoline and diesel consumption is already facing structural pressure from the EV transition, and this is the long-game answer to the Malacca dilemma: reduce dependency by electrifying the entire economy. But that strategy unfolds across years, perhaps decades. It does nothing for a blockade unfolding in the present. Then there is the diplomatic recovery play. China has stepped in as mediator following the collapse of the Islamabad talks, with Xi Jinping proposing a 4-point peace initiative. If Beijing positions itself as the great power that resolved the crisis through diplomacy, it recovers a measure of geopolitical prestige. But Beijing walks into that summit from a posture of structural weakness. The fortress economy cracked, the Iran bridge gone, the shadow fleet being systematically hunted, and the United States having proven it can sever China's cheapest energy supply without firing a single round at a Chinese vessel, without declaring war, and without even publicly mentioning China's name. That is the most sophisticated application of economic warfare in the modern era, and by every indication, China was not prepared for it at this scale or at this speed. There is one more dimension worth surfacing. On April 16th, while global attention remained fixed on Hormuz, Chinese maritime forces moved to obstruct Filipino access to Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. When a major power loses leverage in one theater, doctrine suggests it flexes where it still retains advantage. Whether that constitutes deterrence signaling or genuine escalation pressure is the kind of question intelligence analysts will be debating for months. 1940, forward-looking tension. So here is the honest final assessment. China is not broken by this crisis. Goldman Sachs still projects 4.8% growth. Beijing is too institutionally disciplined to act recklessly, but the damage is real, it is lasting, and it is structural. Every nation watching now understands that Chinese security guarantees become words on paper the moment American military power enters the equation. And for Xi Jinping personally, this is the moment the fortress economy rhetoric collided with operational reality. Not invincible, not insulated, not fortress-like at all. Simply a very large economy with very exposed supply lines and a strategic rival that now knows, with surgical precision, where every one of those lines runs. Analysts believe China has approximately 60 to 90 days of strategic petroleum reserve before refineries must begin cutting production runs. Intelligence assessments suggest the next phase will hinge on whether the strait reopens, whether the diplomatic track produces meaningful de-escalation, and whether Beijing chooses to absorb the lesson quietly or signal pushback in a secondary theater. The deepest deterrent in this entire situation may not be any specific weapon system at all. It may simply be the threat itself, the proven, demonstrated capability that the United States has now placed on the table for every adversary on Earth to study. Sometimes the weapon is the demonstration. What comes next is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself the most important piece of strategic information in this entire briefing. So here's the question we want to put to you directly. Do you believe China will absorb this lesson quietly and accelerate its long-term decoupling from vulnerable choke points? Or is Beijing preparing a response we have not yet seen, in a theater the West is not currently watching? Drop your assessment in the comments below. Your perspective genuinely matters to this conversation, and the depth of analysis in our comment section is part of what makes this community what it is. If this briefing gave you a layer of the story you were not getting elsewhere, sharing it takes 2 seconds and it helps us keep bringing you this level of analysis. Hit that like button. And if you are not yet subscribed to Sentinel News, tap subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because the next 60 to 90 days of this crisis will determine the strategic shape of the next decade, and we are going to be covering every dimension of it as it unfolds. This has been Sentinel News. Stay sharp, stay informed. We will see you in the next briefing.